Today, I'm going to show you guys 9 techniques that will instantly make you a better cook. These are things that are easy to implement, high impact, and free, meaning you don't need to buy a bunch of expensive gear to start doing them right away. All of the techniques in this video are things that I learned cooking professionally in restaurants over the last 15 years or so, and most of them are things that I think home cooks don't know about, and they often make the difference between a good dish and a great one. So let's get started. The first technique that's going to instantly make you a better cook is patting dry your meat before you sear it. And when I say pat dry, I mean remove excessive moisture on the outside of the meat with a paper towel. Cooking dried off meat does a couple of really important things. Number one, it will dramatically reduce the likelihood of your meat sticking to the pan, grill, or sheet tray. A wet piece of meat cools down the cooking surface more than a dry one does, and that causes the proteins in the meat to react with the metal in the pan and bond to it. That means it sticks really bad, and this will tear up your meat and probably burn it. The second thing that patting your meat dry does is enable a lot more browning. Most home cooks get their meat home from the store and it's all wet in the packaging, and they cook it right from there. The thing about wet meat is that it creates steam, which cools down the pan or grill and creates an environment where the Maillard browning reaction can't happen. Basically, if there's water on the surface of the meat, it can't get much above water's boiling point, or 212 F. And Maillard browning starts happening a lot higher than that, around 285 F. So before I sear this thing, I'm gonna pat it dry thoroughly with paper towel on both sides until it has more of a matte finish. Then I'll add my salt, and then I'll put it into a hot pan with plenty of oil. 3 minutes later, when I flip this over, you can see how beautifully golden brown the outside of this meat is. It's got that steakhouse level crust that we're looking for, and it's gonna be super delicious and complicated tasting on the outside. Another good example of why it pays to dry off your meat is whole roasted chicken. To prove my point, I've got 2 birds here. One that I thoroughly patted dry and then salted before roasting, and then a second bird that I salted right out of the plastic. This bird is very wet. Next, I roasted these birds at the same temperature for the same amount of time to show you the difference in color on the outside. And after a 45-minute roast at 450 F, these birds are both 165 in the thigh and about 150 in the breast. But look at the significant difference in the skin. The wet bird's skin is flabby and way under-rendered. The dry bird's skin is evenly brown, super crispy, and just way more delicious looking. So whether it's fish, pork, steak, chicken, scallops, or shrimp, literally all meats, pat them dry thoroughly before you cook them with dry heat, and you'll instantly be a better cook. Okay, the second technique that's gonna make you better at cooking is to salt your dishes as you cook them. Adding salt several times throughout the cooking process is probably one of the main things that differentiates the quality of restaurant food from your average home cook. Think of it this way. In a dish, there is what I'll call the optimal level of salt. If you go below that, you're leaving a lot of flavor on the table, and if you go above that, the dish is gonna be really unpleasant to eat. In the context of a very common dish like beef stew, if we added all that salt at one time, at the end of the cooking process, it wouldn't be evenly distributed amongst the ingredients, and you'd have salty beef gravy sitting on top of bland meat and vegetables. If you added all the salt at the beginning of the cooking process, you'd have overly salty vegetables and then again, bland meat. So the proper way to build up salt in a dish like this would be to salt the meat by itself before roasting, then salt the sweating mirepoix, then later on we're gonna roughly season the cooking liquid, and then at the very end we're gonna taste for seasoning and give our final judgment and adjust it just a little bit more. Yes, that's 4 separate times that you're adding salt to the same dish, but the veggies, the beef, the cooking liquid, and then the entire thing is seasoned evenly and properly. In my cooking, I aim to slowly build the salt level as I go, with the ultimate target of being about 15 to 10% shy of peak seasoning at the end of cooking. That way the final adjustment of salt is totally within my control, and I can taste the stew or whatever it is and add additional salt to feather the salinity right into the sweet spot. The third technique that's gonna instantly make you guys better cooks is to measure in grams instead of volume. Why do I do that? It's more accurate, full stop. The reason I measure by weight is that 100 grams is always 100 grams. It doesn't matter if you're measuring water or sugar or hot sauce, it's always the same. When you measure in volume, the density of the material determines how much of it will fit into the measuring cup or spoon. Measuring flour by volume is a classic way to illustrate this shortcoming. How much flour fits into that cup can vary in either direction up to 30%, and in my experience, that creates a lot of cooking stress. Why is my dough so wet? Why is this dish thicker than it should be? Or why is this dish salty? If you're thinking though, hey Bri, isn't this just home cooking? How accurate do we really need to be? Well, accuracy is really important when you're trying to make a complicated dish that has a ton of different ingredients in it. Think of an all-day cooked beef bourguignon, or a baked good like cookies or a cake. Success with those dishes depends on specific amounts of certain things. So for me, it just makes perfect sense to use the most accurate measurement tool to avoid wasting my time and making avoidable mistakes. However, not all home cooking needs to be super accurate. On a weeknight, if you're just throwing together a 4-ingredient pasta, a handful of this, a pinch of that, and you're gonna be totally fine. But for food projects where you're investing a lot of time and expense, the only way to ensure consistent results, in my opinion, is to measure things on a scale. But if you're one of those staunch volumetric people, first of all, thanks for your fun comment in advance. But also, we convert all of our recipes to volumetric, and they'll be in the description below or on my website at brianlagerstrom.com if you need them. Now, the fourth technique that will instantly make you a culinary bad girl or boy is to press it down in the pan. The first and probably most important use case for pressing things into a pan is when you're cooking meat. This turns a flat piece of meat into a concave one. Concave meat doesn't touch the pan in the middle, and you're left with a hard seared outer edge and a gray steamed middle. Even if you have a super loose grained meat like skirt steak that isn't gonna curve when you cook it in a pan, you still have steam being created under meat if you don't press it down. And just like in the first tip, that's gonna create a bubble underneath that prevents any browning. The best way to prevent this curling or steaming meat is to press this meat into the pan firmly for at least 30 seconds. This ensures every tiny little bit of the meat is touching the oil and the pan, and then after about 30 seconds or so, the meat will relax a little bit, and then the entire surface will get seared evenly instead of just the outer edges. In the restaurant, we would use cast iron weights to keep things stuck down evenly in the pan, but at home, a medium spatula like this with a medium amount of pressure would work fine. Or honestly, if your hands can handle the heat, just like 5 fingers. That'll also keep things stuck down. This pressing things into the pan method is especially important for skin on meats like chicken or fish. For whatever reason, skin contracts way faster than the meat underneath it, so if you don't press it down thoroughly and early, it'll curl up right away and get weird. Outside of just meat, other foods that are significantly improved by being pressed down in the pan are quesadillas, French toast, grilled cheese, burritos, basically any food that you want to be golden brown and crispy. Real quick, I want to thank Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video. Trade is a coffee subscription service that helps you make better coffee at home by delivering it right to your door. I've been a loyal Trade drinker for going on 3 years now, and I love it because I always have coffees in the pantry that are fun, flavorful, and most importantly, fresh. Trade roasts each bag of coffee to order and then delivers it whenever I say so, which for me is about every 2 weeks. When you sign up for Trade, they ask you a quick set of questions to determine what your coffee kinks are, and then they send you selections based on exactly what you like. Trade's coffee stands out to me because they work with over 55 of the top craft roasters in the US to source some of the best coffees available. I've actually been to a few of the roasters in person that they partner with, and the coffee that's getting mailed to me is the same stuff that you can get from those roasters in their shops, and it's just as fresh too. So to upgrade your morning routine, head to drinktrade.com/Brian to save $15 on select plans and get your first bag of coffee for free. Thank you, Trade. Now, the fifth technique that will instantly make you a better cook is oven searing. Classical cooking will teach you that the proper way to make a braise or a stew is to sear your meat in the same pot you're gonna build your braise in. This, on paper, works great. You get some nice fond in the pan, then you deglaze it, and all that flavor gets cooked into the sauce. But in reality, searing meat on the stovetop is time-consuming, messy, and honestly not that effective. So my alternative to stovetop browning is to throw my meat on a sheet tray, then put it in the oven either under the broiler or at a high temperature to brown it. This way I don't have to babysit a hot pot of splattery meat for like 30 minutes, and I get some downtime to do dishes, prep the rest of my dish, or even start the cooking process. In my 30-minute chili video, I actually got the entire aromatic and tomato base cooked in the time it took me to broil my ground beef. That's 2 things happening at the same time, and it basically halved the cook time of the whole recipe. Oven searing is obviously super efficient in terms of time, but also there's luckily no compromises in terms of flavor. Meat that's seared under the broiler is just as juicy and just as golden brown as meat that you'd cook on the stove. Oven seared meat also yields a flavorful fond and releases juices that we can then add back in the final dish to make it taste meatier. Now, the sixth technique that's going to instantly make you a better cook is to dry brine your meats. Brining in general is the process of adding salt to a meat to make it more tender, more juicy, and better seasoned throughout. There are 2 styles of browning. Wet, which is where you mix salt and water, stir it together, and then submerge that meat in that brine for some amount of time, usually several hours because wet brining is kind of slow. The second type is dry brines, and that's where you put the salt right on the outside surface of the meat. Dry brines are usually faster and a lot more potent than wet brines, in my experience. To clarify, a dry brine is different than just putting salt on meat and cooking it right away. When you dry brine something, you do salt it, but then you put it in the fridge for 15 minutes to an hour. Here's an example of how to use a dry brine on, say, a chicken breast, a cut that is very tricky to get right without some kind of brine. I'll salt 2 chicken breasts for about 30 minutes in the fridge before I cook them. The salt will denature the proteins, making the breast meat more tender. It'll also help the breast meat hold onto its water as it cooks, so it's significantly less dry, and it'll season the whole thing throughout, making it taste more chickeny. This quick 30-minute dry brine is something that I use all the time for salmon, steaks, pork chops, or even whole chickens. Ooh, and I also need to mention that dry brining things makes them more forgiving and easier to cook. Since the meat is holding onto a lot more water, you've got more wiggle room in terms of cook time. Unbrined meats tend to start squeezing out their moisture around 130F and above, whereas dry brine meats hold onto that juice up until like 160 or 170F. Dry brining is fast, super effective, and something that you could implement tonight if you wanted to become a better cook. Okay, technique number 7 is to preheat your sheet tray. This is a really simple one, but it's quite impactful. Basically, preheat your oven, put your sheet tray in cold, then cut your meat or vegetables while that oven and sheet tray get ripping hot. 15 minutes later, I'll drop my oiled and salted potatoes right onto the tray, and ooh, listen to that sizzle. This will brown the potatoes more deeply and cook them faster. Usually this cuts about 5 to 8 minutes off the cook time, which on a busy weeknight matters a lot. When you put cold vegetables onto a cold sheet tray, the whole thing goes through this long transitional phase where it's just heating up and not actually cooking. Throwing the veggies right onto a ripping hot sheet tray starts that cooking process almost instantly. You get better color and less cook time. There's really not a lot more to say. This one is a total no-brainer. Now, the 8th technique that'll instantly make you guys better cooks is the concept of mise en place, which is a French term for everything in its place. And in the professional kitchen, we use the term mise en place to refer to having everything prepared 100% before you actually start doing your work. You've probably heard of mise en place before and wondered how it applies to you as a home cook. And it's quite simple. Before you start applying heat to food, have a plan and prepare the things that you'll need in advance so that you can put all of your focus on executing the steps of the recipe instead of running back and forth to the pantry to get that apple cider vinegar that you forgot. In practice at home, mise en place means reading through your recipe a couple of times to make sure you understand all of the steps from start to finish, or watching the recipe video a couple of times, and then gathering all of your ingredients in one place before you start doing anything at the stove. Sometimes mise en place means measuring out everything specifically and meticulously ahead of time, or sometimes it just means having the ingredients and tools that you'll need at hand in one place. Now, to clarify, this mise en place advice is also for me. Despite having 14 or 15 years of professional cooking experience, I still make mistakes all the time, and it's usually because I wasn't fully placed out. Sometimes I'll speed through reviewing the recipe and then I'll forget a step and then have to start over. Or worse, when I'm filming, I'll start before I'm fully placed out, and then all of a sudden I realize I've forgotten an ingredient, and then I have to stop and go to the store. In general, cooking is a lot more enjoyable and often more successful when you have everything placed out. When I'm placed out at home, I feel more relaxed, more in control, and when I'm cooking, I don't really have to think about it. I can just have fun. The 9th and last technique that is going to instantly make you a better cook is the steam finish. Sounds fancy, but it's not. Let me explain. At home, Lauren and I eat a lot of vegetables, and they're usually roasted in the oven. For the longest time, I would just chop some broccoli, toss it with oil, and then roast it in the oven until it was roasty looking. The problem with this method is that the broccoli gets dry and fibrous well before it's tender all the way through. You get some tasty browning on the outside, but the inside is tough. The same goes for vegetables that are sauteed on the stovetop. So to balance the trade-off between roasty flavor and tender vegetable texture, I like to finish them with steam. In the oven, that means I'll roast them high and hot at 450 for about 15 minutes or so. Then I'll move the veggies over to a bowl and cover with a lid or a sheet tray or foil to trap in the heat and steam to slowly finish cooking these vegetables through. On the stove, I'll saute over medium-high heat for about 10 minutes or so. Then I'll lower the heat, add a splash of water, and tent the whole thing with foil or a lid. lid. The water creates steam inside the pan and that finishes softening up the vegetables. This works really well for pretty much all vegetables, but it's especially good for fibrous stuff like cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, or snap peas. The added benefit to finishing these vegetables with lower heat is that you're cooking out less of their nutrients. So in theory, they're better for you. And they taste better too. This process works well for certain meats too. Shrimp are a great example. I don't like to hard sear shrimp that much because they dry out and get rubbery really quickly. So I'll give them a really quick sear over high heat, then turn the heat down, add in a splash of stock or white wine, then tent the shrimp and let them steam over low heat until they're barely cooked through. This way they're more tender, more plump, and the risk of overcooking them is much lower. So there you go, 9 easy to implement and free cooking techniques that will instantly make you a culinary black belt. If you guys like list videos, then please check out this video where I count down my favorite 10 spices of all time. It's a spicy one. Shut up. Anyways, thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video, and I'll see you next time.